Welcome everyone to a special edition of the Buck Stops here, the official show of NotInHallOfFame.com. And I'm your host, Kirk Buckner, and I've got with me a very special guest. I'm really excited about this because I love peeling back the curtain of football history. And when you get a chance to talk to a football historian who's got a great Christmas present for the football fan in your life, I've got Darin Hayes from the Pigskin Dispatch. How you doing?
Hey, great, Kirk. How are you? Thanks for the invite.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Darren and I forget how we even got to know each other, just probably through, I guess they call it the X now. Is that what the kids are calling it? And just
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah.
our mutual love of football. Darren's one of the voters on the Pro Football Hall of Fame Revisited project. And and then just an email, you were mentioning that you finished a book. It's like, oh my God, okay, well, I got to talk to you about it. So I love the intro that you've got on your link where when people talk about the greatest football team of all time, the first thing that you're going to think of is possibly the 72 Dolphins or the inaugural Cleveland Browns in the AAFC. You've got a completely different take on this.
Yeah, and it kind of caught me by surprise. The 1903 Franklin All-Stars, and people are going to say, who the heck are the 1903 Franklin All-Stars? Franklin, Pennsylvania. I live in Erie, Pennsylvania, right up in the stovepipe of
Mhm.
Pennsylvania, if you think about it. So Pittsburgh's about 100 miles south. Cleveland's about 100 miles east. Buffalo's 100, I'm sorry, Cleveland's 100 miles west. Buffalo's 100 miles east. So Franklin is about halfway between Erie and Pittsburgh. And it's a little town in what they call the Oil Valley, Venango County of Pennsylvania. And that's where the first commercial oil well was developed by Edwin Drake back in the 19th century, probably about 2, 3 miles away from there in a town called Titusville. So Franklin and another town called Oil City were the benefactors of the first commercial oil well. They became instantly filthy rich in both these towns. And with that, in the 19th century, they started to have some leisure time. Some of that leisure time turned into sports as baseball was developing, football at the end of the 19th century. And these two towns, Oil City and Franklin, are about 9 miles apart, and they had were extremely competitive in business. Well, became extremely competitive in sports. So the first of all, the baseball teams went, and where there's money, there's wagering on sports, even back then. And so they were heavily bet. And it all came down to football. They were just had some local kids playing football right at the turn of the last century. Um, Oil City decided in 1902 they had 3 games scheduled, one on Thanksgiving Day, one the day after, and one the Saturday after Thanksgiving. So Thanksgiving Day, they played. Oil City had brought in a couple ringers and ended up beating Franklin by the score like 6-5. I think, I don't remember exactly, but I think it was 1 point difference. So, and Franklin was kind of say, so wow, we went up against these guys and the ringers that they brought in.
Mhm.
There was the original National Football League, which occurred in 1902, and many people haven't heard of that. It was basically baseball derivatives of professional football. The baseball teams of the Philadelphia Athletics, Philadelphia Phillies, and Philadelphia, they decided to sponsor baseball teams. As a matter of fact, Connie Mack was the manager of the Philadelphia Athletics football team as well. And some of the players that played on professional baseball and major league on those teams played too. Well, they also had a team in Pittsburgh called the Pittsburgh Stars, 3-team league. Um, and so that they had their championship in Pittsburgh. The Philadelphia Athletics played the Pittsburgh Stars on what we would call Black Friday. So Franklin, Oil City have their game. Franklin loses. Philadelphia or Oil City says we're going to get even more ringers for our Saturday game in this rubber match. They go down and they hire the entire Philadelphia Athletics team who's visiting in Pittsburgh and played the day before. They come up. So Oil City comes up with a whole new team 2 days later after their initial playing, and they beat Franklin. Well, the Franklin people are livid. They lost money. They paid their debts.
Mhm.
And the main gentleman of that, Franklin, who was probably the wealthiest guy, their General Charles Miller, he gets really miffed. He tells his manager of the team, who was a local clothing salesman, he says, I don't care what it takes. Next year, 1903, buy me every great player you can to beat Oil City. And that's what Dave Prince, this clothing manager merchant, did. Went out and hired the best players that money could buy in football. The equivalent of you or I going out with unlimited funds and hiring the NFL All Pro team next year to be on our team for play a whole season. So that's what they did. And boy, did the results come out really cool for them. So that's why my interest started. I was reading about it in some PFRA coffin corner articles from like the 1980s on this, and I became aware of it. And I work with some people from Franklin. I asked them about it, and they have never heard of the Franklin All Stars, and they're from that town. I'm a former football official for high school. I officiated down there quite a bit in actually the Oil City and Franklin high school games. So it really caught my interest, the story did. But then when I started getting into this team and looking at what they did, when we talked about dominant teams, they had the most dominant defense that I've ever heard of. Now, get this, they went unscored upon, unbeaten, of course, in 12 games, including 2 games in a postseason tournament at Madison Square Gardens with the best 4 teams in the nation that the Madison Square Garden folks could get.
Mm-hmm.
And only 2 teams crossed midfield all season long against the Franklin All-Stars. And they were on fumble recoveries by the other team.
When you're doing your research, though, like, how do you even just, like begin to do that? I guess through periodicals or
Well, it started off, the PFRA got me involved. I started
yeah.
looking at, I went down to Venango Historical Society, which is in downtown Franklin, covers both Oil City and Franklin. Got
Okay.
a lot of information from them. But this team from Franklin people were so PO'd about the Oil City in this competition.
Mm-hmm.
It became front page news every single day in the
Oh,
Franklin
okay.
Evening News. So I mean, you think our sports coverage is great today? I mean, our newspaper coverage isn't that good because we have TV and radio and everything else, good media and the internet. That's all they had back then was a newspaper. They had every single thing these guys, they would sneeze on the football field, they would record it. So excellent job. And
Oh,
that's
wow.
before
Okay.
sports journalism. So it was a great, informational find, from Franklin, just from their newspaper. They told me everything I needed to know. I just compiled it together in one book. But so they're dominant on defense like that. Offensively, I get this, they scored 0.97 points per minute. Now, that doesn't, just to equate that, I did a post
Is
on
that even
Pigskin
possible?
Dispatch. Okay, you've heard of the point a minute teams of Michigan,
Mhm.
right about this time, 1903. They scored 0.71 points per minute. If you go back and look at how much time they played and everything, college right about that same time, they were called a point a minute team in college. They scored like 0.74, 0.97 points a minute. Touchdowns were only worth 5 points then too. So put that in perspective. If touchdowns are worth 6 like they are today, they're over a point a minute. Franklin is.
Mhm.
And I know this because the uh, newspaper I was talking about, the Franklin Evening News, they had the time of each half. And it sounds kind of weird to us today because we say, well, a half is a half. Well, back then they would start games at 3 p.m. before daylight savings time. Okay.
Mhm.
So think about that in late October, November. They're playing games. They start at 3 o'clock. Usually there'll be an argument over the rules before they start the game for a half hour. Teams are coming in by train. Somebody's going to be 20 minutes late. It happens all the time. So they have to make like the first half be 20 minutes and the second half like 7 minutes. Or, there's weird oddities like that. Sometimes it's different every game. So I knew how much each half was. I knew how much time they played. I knew how many points they scored. I just did the simple math in a spreadsheet and figured that out. So not only the Kansas City Chiefs, 2 years ago when they had their offensive explosion, which the article I wrote a couple years ago, they were the second highest scoring team ever in the NFL. They scored just over a half a point a minute. The Rams of late 1950s, with Bob Waterhouse and Norm Van Brocklin at quarterback, they scored like 0.7 points per minute. So this team scored 0.2 points per minute more than the best NFL team ever offense and the most dominant defense ever. That's why when the newspaper back then said they were world's greatest team, it's true 120 years later that no mainstream professional team has ever equated to what they've done.
What were the type of opponents that they had?
Well, sometimes back then it was weird because they played some college teams, so some
Mhm.
people might frown upon that. But remember,
Not then.
professional
Yeah.
professional football was looked down upon.
Right. Right.
It was sort of insulting if you were a professional football player. College football was king for probably right well into the 1930s 30s, 40s, probably to the greatest game ever played in the 1950s. College was much far superior. People watched and supported than professional football. So they did play some professional teams. Funny enough, they never did get to play Oil City that year. Oil City forfeited and decided not to play the 3 games they had scheduled. But so, but they did play the World Series of Football 1902 champions, Syracuse. They beat them handily, like 12-0. They played Watertown, who was considered the best team in 1903. That was the championship game of the Madison Square Garden game. They beat them 12-0. They played the Pittsburgh East Enders, which was the former Jay Lalis team, which was a pretty good team professionally. And then they played some local colleges and some semi-pro teams, I guess we would call it, throughout. So they weren't all cupcake games. And the Franklin team, they didn't want to play cupcake games. They wanted to bring the best competition in because they wanted to prove something. And actually, back then, you had to have the home team had to pay for the visiting team to come to their town, pay for their train tickets, pay for overnight, everything else. Well, nobody wanted to pay to have Franklin come to their town because they were scared. They said, "Boy, we're going to pay this team to come in and wallop us." So Franklin had to play every game at home during the regular season, the first 10 games. They had to invite the people to come play them and offer them like astronomical money back then, like thousands of dollars for this team to come in, these teams to come in and play them. So they tried to get the best competition they could.
Who was the best player on that team?
Well, that's hard to say. Now that's what sort of started the conversation with you and I on this book is because you have 2 or 3 players on that team that we're voting for in the not in the Hall of Fame, ballots for
Yeah,
these early things. So probably the most famous player is Blondie Wallace. Blondie
kind of what
Wallace,
I'm talking about. Yeah.
his name has come up quite a bit. My friend Greg Frisari just wrote a book, Gridiron Legacy, about the Canton Massillon uh, controversy, the scandal of 1906. So 3 years prior to that, Blondie Wallace was on the Franklin team. Um, you had some guys like Ben Roller, Doc Rollers, people
Mhm.
know him. He was probably the best player of the era. He played for Oil City in that 1902 team and played for Lalis later on against Franklin in 1903. Well, in the championship games at Madison Square Garden, Ben Roller got hired by Franklin, so he played on the Franklin team for that. Curly Davidson was another great player, another Philadelphia Athletic player that came and played for Franklin that year. Jack Hayden was a quarterback. He was a Philadelphia Athletic. He also played Major League Baseball for the Athletics and a few other Major League Baseball teams. He was quite an athlete. He was maybe what a true professional athlete at the time. He played, all baseball season, all football season, so sort of a professional athlete all year long. Tech Matthews was sort of the guy, and people, not a lot of people have heard of him, but he was a W&J, Washington Jefferson player that came through the ranks and ended up being their captain and their star for a couple years, even prior to this 1903 team. Um, Lynn Sweet was probably the greatest center of the era. He played on Franklin. Uh, Twister Steinberg was
I
another
love
great,
that name.
great back. Yeah, they had some great names. Well, Lynn Sweet was called Pop Sweet, so people might recognize that. Twister Steinberg, Jack Lang was another great lineman, and Herman Kirchhoff, who was probably the biggest player in the era, and he's definitely been on the ballot. This dude played football for it was like 20 years, which is unbelievable for that era and as
Oh my God,
aggressive
yeah.
as football was. But he played out in Colorado, played for like the Denver Athletic Club, played in the Chicago Athletic Club, played in that original NFL for Philadelphia. And then he ended up coming in to play for the Franklin Stars and then was found in the Canton and Massillon games even after Franklin. So this dude was a big man. And remember back then offenses were a little bit different. It's 3 years before the forward pass, and linemen could run with the ball. So which they had tackles back and the guards back formation, so they could
Which
hand the
there's
ball to
footage of
big
this.
guys. Right. So
Yeah.
yes. So they were just loaded with talent. Like I said, they were called the Franklin All Stars, and it was truly an all-star team.
I don't want to sort of like it's I want to spoil the end. It's 120 years after, but what I what I what I'm a little stunned at, and maybe you can sort of like touch on that briefly because I want people to to get the book off, of course. Why did they fold right after? Or am I mistaken in that?
Well, what they did is they looked at it. They said, we can't do any better than this. We went
Okay.
undefeated, went unscored upon. I mean, they probably ended up even with all the betting,
Hmm.
maybe they probably lost money, but maybe broke even with the betting. It's kind of unclear how much the owners and the financiers ended up winning, especially up in New York. Um, but they really couldn't accomplish anymore. But what it did is it ended professional football in Pennsylvania for years and years. I mean, if you think about it, 1892, the first
Okay.
paid professional player was Pudge Heffelfinger
Right.
in the Pittsburgh area. You had John Bralier, who was the Latrobe Athletic Club, Western Pennsylvania.
Hmm.
So, sort of professional football, those first 20 years or first 10 years evolved right in Western Pennsylvania. So, what it did when Franklin hired all these players away, it somewhat helped to dissolve the original NFL. They only had that 1 year season, but all the great players from Pittsburgh and Philadelphia Athletics were now in Franklin, so they didn't want to play anymore. They that sort of ended that.
Hmm.
The year after that, in 1904, all these players migrated across the Ohio line, which isn't far from Franklin. It's only like 20 to 30 miles. They migrated over, started playing for Canton and Massillon and Shelby and Akron and all the teams over and made the mythical Ohio League even 10 years before the NFL. So,
Okay. And I guess the owners proved their point.
right, yes.
I was getting like Simpsons Mr. Burns vibes, from that whole story when he bought the what was it, 9 baseball players.
Right, right.
Yeah.
It was similar to that, but
Yeah.
General Charles Miller, he was a philanthropist. He was a very good Christian man, very well into the community. Everything was about the community, and that's what some of the people said. He didn't do it for so much for himself of losing money in the betting. He did it because the community was embarrassed by having those ringers brought in the year prior by Oil City.
Okay. And the book's called The World's Greatest Pro Gridiron Team.
Yes, the
Okay.
1903 Franklin All-Stars is how it ends. Yes.
And where can we get that?
Well, it's available on Amazon, or if it's even easier, you should just go to pigskindispatch.com. We have a spot for it right on our front page, and you can get right into the Amazon from there to purchase.
All right, perfect. Darin, thanks so much for doing this. I would love to have you on again. I'm sure we can come up with another great topic of just old school football. I love this sort of stuff.
Yeah, anytime. You just let me know.
Great. Sounds great. Darin, thanks so much. And everyone, go out and buy this book. Take care, everybody.